The encounter. John's eyes fluttered open, his head throbbing with a dull ache. The world around him was a swirl of colors and shapes that didn't make sense. As his vision cleared, he realized he wasn't anywhere familiar. The walls shimmered with a metallic glow, pulsating faintly like they were alive. Strange symbols etched into the surface glowed faintly blue, casting an eerie light across the room. Where am I?" he muttered, his voice hoarse. He tried to sit up, but his body felt heavy, almost like gravity was stronger here. Looking down, he noticed he was lying on a smooth surface that felt cool against his skin. His clothes were intact, but they looked slightly different, cleaner, almost unnaturally so. Before he could gather his thoughts, a soft sound broke the silence. It was the faint hum of a door sliding open. John turned his head sharply, his heart racing. A figure entered the room, moving gracefully, yet hesitantly. It wasn't human. The alien girl stood at the doorway, her large, luminous eyes fixed on him. Her skin was a pale shade of lavender, shimmering faintly like polished stone. Her hair, or what resembled it, flowed in soft tendrils, defying gravity as it moved around her shoulders. She wore a robe-like outfit, simple yet elegant, with intricate patterns that seemed to shift as the light hit them. Who are you?" John stammered, his voice trembling. The girl hesitated, her hands clasped in front of her. Her gaze wasn't hostile, but it carried an intensity that made John uneasy. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but quivering, as if she were holding back a storm of emotions. "You don't understand, human," she said, her words strangely clear, as though she'd spoken his language her whole life. "You belong to me." John's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about? I don't belong to anyone." She stepped closer, her movements cautious, almost nervous. "You were dying. I saved you. Now, we are bound." "Bound?" John's voice rose. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't agree to anything." The girl flinched, her expression a mix of guilt and determination. "You didn't have to. It was the only way. If I hadn't, you wouldn't be here." John's mind raced. He tried to remember what had happened before he woke up here. Flashes of memory came to him. A ship, a crash, fire, and pain. He remembered struggling to breathe, feeling the cold grip of death. Then, nothing. "You mean I was dying?" he asked, his voice softening slightly. She nodded. "Yes, and I used the bond to pull you back. But now you are part of my world." John shook his head, frustration and fear bubbling up inside him. "I don't even know your name. You can't just decide something like that without asking me." The alien girl looked down, her hands tightening into fists. "My name is Lyra," she said after a moment. "And I didn't want this either. But it's done. If you die, I die. If you live, I live. We are connected now." The weight of her words settled over John like a heavy blanket. He stared at her, trying to process everything. Bound. Connected. What kind of nightmare was this? Before he could respond, a deep rumbling noise echoed through the room. Lyra's head snapped up, her eyes wide with alarm. She rushed to the wall and pressed her hand against a glowing panel. Symbols lit up, and a small screen appeared, showing a group of shadowy figures moving through a dark corridor. "They found us," she whispered, her voice trembling. Who's found us?" John asked, his panic rising. Lyra turned to him, her expression urgent. "The hunters. They're here for you." "For me?" John's voice cracked. "Why would anyone come for me? I'm just a guy." Lyra didn't answer. Instead, she reached out and grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet. Her grip was firm, stronger than her delicate appearance suggested. "There's no time to explain. We have to move." John stumbled as she led him toward the door, his legs still weak. "Wait. I don't even know what's going on. How am I supposed to trust you?" Lyra paused, looking back at him, Her eyes glistened with a mix of fear and determination. "You don't have to trust me. But if they catch you, it won't matter. You'll be dead. And so will I." The gravity of her words hit him hard. He didn't know this alien girl, didn't understand her motives, but something in her voice told him she wasn't lying. For now, he had no choice. The two of them slipped out into the corridor, the walls glowing faintly to light their path. John's mind raced with questions, but none of them mattered in that moment. All he knew was that danger was closing in, and his only hope was to follow the alien girl who claimed he belonged to her. The escape attempt. The corridor stretched endlessly ahead, illuminated by faintly glowing lines running along the walls and floor. John stumbled as he followed Lyra, his thoughts swirling in chaos. The eerie hum of the structure around them seemed alive, pulsing with an alien rhythm. "Where are we going?" he panted, struggling to keep up with her swift, graceful movements. "Somewhere safe," Lyra replied without looking back. Her voice was tense, every syllable laced with urgency. Safe. The word sounded hollow. Nothing about this situation felt safe. John's mind screamed at him to stop, to question her further, but the pounding noise that echoed from somewhere behind them pushed him forward. He didn't know what those hunters were, but he didn't want to find out. The two turned a corner, entering a larger chamber. The walls here were lined with strange, translucent pods filled with glowing liquid. Shadows moved within them, humanoid shapes suspended in some kind of stasis. John's stomach churned. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice hushed. Lyra paused briefly, her gaze darting around the room. "A storage facility. The hunters use it to preserve their prey." John's eyes widened. "Prey? What the hell kind of place is this? And why are they after me?" Lyra hesitated, then grabbed his arm, pulling him toward a hidden panel in the wall. "I told you, there's no time for this. We have to keep moving." "No." John yanked his arm free, planting his feet. "I'm not taking another step until you tell me what's going on. Who are these hunters? Why am I here? And what the hell did you do to me?" Lyra's face twisted with frustration, but she didn't move to grab him again. Instead, she exhaled sharply, her tendrils flickering faintly. "The hunters are a faction of my people. They collect rare beings from across the galaxy, creatures, artifacts, anything valuable. You're human, John, one of the rarest species. They see you as a prize." John's chest tightened. "A prize? I didn't ask for any of this. I was just trying to survive after my ship crashed." "And you would have died," Lyra said softly. "I saved you because I couldn't let that happen. But now they've tracked the bond. They'll stop at nothing to take you." John took a step back, his mind reeling. "You're saying this is your fault? You brought me into this mess?" Lyra flinched, the guilt in her expression unmistakable. "Yes, but I didn't have a choice. If I hadn't bonded with you, you'd be gone." Before John could respond, the chamber filled with a low, vibrating hum. The air seemed to thicken, and a sudden coldness swept over them. Lyra's eyes darted to the entrance, her body tensing. "They're here," she whispered. The shadows at the far end of the room shifted, coalescing into tall, armored figures. Their movements were unnaturally smooth, their sleek, black suits reflecting the light of the pods. Each carried a weapon that hummed with an ominous energy. John's instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs felt rooted to the ground. Lyra didn't hesitate. She stepped in front of him, raising her hands. The glowing lines on her skin flared bright, casting a protective aura around them. "Stay behind me," she ordered, her voice steady now, commanding. The hunters advanced, their weapons aimed. One of them spoke in a guttural language, the sound grating on John's ears. Lyra responded sharply in the same tongue, her tone defiant. "What are you doing?" John asked, his voice barely audible. "Buying time," Lyra replied without looking back. "They won't listen, but I can slow them down." The hunter in the center raised its weapon, and without warning, a bolt of energy shot toward them. Lyra's shield absorbed the blast, the impact sending ripples of light through the air. She staggered but held her ground. "Run," she shouted, her voice breaking. John didn't need to be told twice. He turned and bolted toward the opposite end of the chamber, weaving between the pods. The sound of energy blasts and alien roars filled the space, the chaos almost deafening. Lyra followed moments later, catching up to him as they reached another corridor. She grabbed his arm and pulled him through a narrow passageway, the walls pressing close around them. "You're not just a prize to them, John," she said as they ran. "You're something much more dangerous. They won't stop until they have you." "What does that mean?" John yelled, his breath ragged. "What's so special about me?" Later, Lyra snapped, her voice sharp with urgency. "Right now, we just have to survive." The corridor opened into a vast, cavernous space. Strange, organic structures jutted from the walls, and the ground beneath their feet felt soft, like flesh. In the center of the room was a platform with what looked like a console, its surface alive with glowing symbols. Lyra ran to the console, her fingers flying over the symbols. The platform began to hum, a faint energy field forming around it. "Get on," she shouted. John hesitated, glancing back at the corridor they had just come from. The hunters were closing in, their dark forms silhouetted against the glowing walls. He didn't have a choice. He leaped onto the platform just as Lyra activated it. A blinding light engulfed them, and the ground seemed to disappear beneath his feet. The last thing he heard before everything went white was Lyra's voice, trembling yet resolute. "You have to trust me, John. This is only the beginning." The hunters. When the blinding light faded, John felt a rush of cold air against his skin. He stumbled forward, his legs shaking beneath him as his surroundings came into focus. They were no longer in the strange organic chamber. Instead, they stood in what appeared to be a dense, alien forest. The sky above was a swirling mix of deep purples and fiery reds, and the towering trees seemed alive, their branches curling and shifting like serpents. John turned to Lyra, who was already scanning the area, her luminous eyes darting from shadow to shadow. She looked exhausted, her normally glowing skin dimmer than before. "Where are we now?" John asked, his voice trembling. "A sanctuary," Lyra replied, though her tone betrayed little confidence. "At least it used to be. It's hidden, but not invincible. The hunters will find us eventually." "Great," John muttered, rubbing his temples. "So we're still running. Why don't we just stop and fight?" Lyra shot him a sharp look. "You don't understand what we're dealing with. These hunters aren't just soldiers. They're engineered for this. Faster, stronger, smarter than anything you've encountered. Fighting them isn't an option." "Then what is?" John demanded. "We just keep running until they catch us." Lyra hesitated, her gaze softening. "There's a way to stop them, but it's dangerous. And it involves you." "Of course it does," John said bitterly. "Because apparently, I'm the galaxy's favorite trophy." Before Lyra could respond, a low, guttural growl echoed through the forest. John froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The sound didn't come from a single source. It seemed to surround them, reverberating off the twisted trees. "They're here," Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible. John's mouth went dry. "Already? How did they find us so fast?" Lyra didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed his hand and pulled him deeper into the forest. The ground beneath their feet was spongy, releasing faint bioluminescent glows with each step. The trees seemed to part for Lyra, but reached out toward John, their tendrils brushing against his arms like curious animals. "Stay close," Lyra said, her grip tightening on his hand. "This forest is alive. It senses fear." "Fantastic," John muttered, glancing nervously at the shifting branches above. "Add that to the list of things trying to kill me." Suddenly, a loud crack split the air, followed by a blinding flash of light. John was thrown to the ground, the force of the explosion ringing in his ears. He scrambled to his feet, coughing as the acrid smell of burnt vegetation filled his lungs. "They're using trackers," Lara said, her voice urgent. "We can't outrun them like this." "Then what do we do?" John shouted, panic creeping into his voice. Lara hesitated for a fraction of a second before pulling a small device from her belt. It looked like a metallic orb, its surface covered in glowing runes. She pressed it into John's hands. "Hold this," she said. "If they get too close, use it." "What does it do?" John asked, staring at the orb. "It's a deterrent," Lara replied, though her tone suggested she wasn't telling him everything. "But it's unstable. Only use it as a last resort." Before John could argue, another growl echoed through the forest, closer this time. Lara's eyes darted to the shadows, and her entire body tensed. "Run," she shouted, shoving him forward. John didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted through the forest, his heart pounding in his chest. The trees seemed to come alive around him, their branches reaching out to slow his progress. He could hear the hunters closing in, their guttural voices growing louder. Lara stayed close behind him, her movements impossibly swift and fluid. She occasionally turned to fire bursts of energy from her hands, the blasts lighting up the forest and momentarily halting their pursuers. As they ran, the forest began to change. The glowing ground gave way to sharp, crystalline terrain, and the trees grew more twisted and menacing. John's legs burned with effort, but he didn't dare stop. "We're almost there," Lara called out, though John had no idea where there was. Just as he thought he couldn't run any farther, the forest opened up into a massive clearing. At its center was a strange structure, a towering spire made of interlocking metallic plates, glowing faintly with the same blue light as Lara's markings. "What is that?" John asked, gasping for breath. "A beacon," Lara replied, her voice steady. "It can disrupt their tracking systems, but only for a short time." She darted toward the spire, her hands glowing as she activated a hidden panel. Symbols lit up on its surface, and the structure began to hum, a low vibration that seemed to ripple through the ground. John turned to look back at the forest. Shadows moved between the trees, their sleek forms barely visible. The hunters were close, too close. "Hurry up," he yelled, his voice cracking. "I'm trying." Lara shot back, her fingers flying over the panel. The hunters emerged from the tree line, their dark armor gleaming in the spire's light. John's pulse quickened as he realized how fast they were moving. One of them raised its weapon, aiming directly at Lara. "No," John shouted, instinctively stepping forward. Without thinking, he activated the orb in his hand. It pulsed with a brilliant light before releasing a shockwave that knocked the hunters off their feet. The force sent John stumbling backward, his vision blurring. When the dust settled, he saw the hunters regrouping, their movements slower but no less determined. The orb had bought them a few moments, but it wasn't enough. Lara finally stepped away from the spire, her face pale. "It's done. The beacon will mask our location. For now." John stared at her, his chest heaving. "For now. That's all we get. It's all we need," Lara said, her voice firm. "Come on. We have to keep moving." As they disappeared into the forest once more, John couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much larger and much deadlier. The hunters weren't just after him for who he was. They were after something far more dangerous, the secret he didn't even know he carried. The bond. The air around them grew denser, and the towering trees of the alien forest gave way to a rocky landscape dotted with glowing crystal formations. The strange humming of the spire faded into the distance as Lara and John pressed forward, their pace slowing as exhaustion set in. John finally stopped, doubling over to catch his breath. His legs felt like lead, and every inhale burned his lungs. I can't keep running," he said between gasps. Lara turned back to him, her glowing eyes narrowing. "We don't have a choice." "Maybe you don't," John snapped, straightening up despite the ache in his muscles. "But I do. I deserve answers, Lara. Real ones. No more half-truths or cryptic warnings. What's this bond you keep talking about? Why are they hunting me? And why the hell am I so important? Lara hesitated, her gaze dropping to the ground. Her tendrils dimmed, their usual fluid motion slowing. You wouldn't understand, she said softly. Try me, John shot back, his voice firm. Because right now, I'm risking my life for something I don't even understand. She let out a long, shaky breath and gestured for him to sit. Reluctantly, John lowered himself onto one of the glowing rocks, its surface warm against his hands. Lara remained standing, her posture rigid as she spoke. When I found you, you were dying, she began, her voice quieter than usual. Your ship had crashed into one of our restricted zones. You had injuries that no human could have survived. I couldn't let you die. So you bonded with me? John asked, his tone tinged with sarcasm. It's not that simple, Lara said sharply, her eyes flashing. The bond is ancient, forbidden. It's a merging of life forces, something my people only use in the most desperate circumstances. It's not just a connection, John. It's a shared existence. John frowned, trying to process her words. Shared existence. What does that even mean? It means our lives are intertwined now, Lara explained. If you're hurt, I feel it. If you die, I die. And if I die, she trailed off, her voice faltering. John stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. So you're saying we're linked forever? Lara nodded. Yes, and that's why the hunters are after you. The bond isn't just a survival mechanism. It amplifies certain abilities. In your case, it's made you unique. Unique how? John pressed, his frustration mounting. You're human, Lara said, as if that explained everything. When John's expression didn't change, she sighed and continued. Humans are rare in this part of the galaxy. Your physiology is adaptable in ways my people don't fully understand. The bond has amplified that adaptability, making you valuable. Dangerous. Dangerous. John repeated, his voice rising. I'm not dangerous. I didn't ask for this. I know, Lara said, her tone softening. But the hunters don't care. To them, you're a weapon they can control. Or worse, dismantle. John shuddered at the implication. Dismantle. Lara nodded grimly. They'll experiment on you, extract what they can, and discard the rest. That's why I can't let them take you. John leaned back, his mind reeling. Every answer seemed to raise more questions, and the gravity of his situation pressed down on him like a physical weight. He was just an ordinary guy, a mechanic on a transport ship. How had his life turned into this nightmare? Why did you do it? He asked after a long silence. Why bond with me if it's so dangerous? Lara hesitated, her gaze shifting to the horizon. Because I saw something in you, she said finally. Something worth saving. John opened his mouth to respond, but a sudden tremor shook the ground beneath them. The glowing crystals vibrated, emitting a high-pitched whine that set John's teeth on edge. What now? He groaned, scrambling to his feet. Lara's eyes narrowed, her body tensing. They found us. How? John asked, his voice tinged with panic. I thought the beacon was supposed to hide us. It did, Lara said, already scanning their surroundings. But it only bought us time. The bond is like a beacon of its own. It's impossible to mask completely. Another tremor rocked the ground, and this time, cracks formed in the rocky surface. John watched in horror as one of the glowing crystals shattered, releasing a burst of energy that scorched the nearby terrain. We need to move, Lara said, grabbing his arm. Now. John didn't argue. The two of them sprinted away from the growing fissures, the ground trembling beneath their feet. Behind them, dark figures emerged from the shadows, sleek and menacing, their weapons glinting in the dim light. Can't we fight them? John asked, his voice breathless. Lara shook her head. Not yet. "You're not ready." "Not ready for what?" John demanded, but Lara didn't answer. She was focused on the terrain ahead, her glowing markings flaring brighter with each step. The landscape began to shift, the ground sloping downward into a cavernous opening. The air grew colder, and an eerie stillness settled over them as they descended. "This way," Lara said, leading him into the cavern. The walls glistened with a strange, reflective substance, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed around them. As they moved deeper into the cavern, Lara slowed, her breathing heavy. John noticed her steps faltering and reached out to steady her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his concern genuine despite his frustration. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice was weak. "The bond takes a toll on me, too." John frowned, guilt creeping into his chest. He didn't fully understand the bond, but he could see its effect on her. Whatever connection they shared, it was more than just a lifeline. It was a burden they both carried. They reached the heart of the cavern, where a pool of glowing liquid reflected the crystalline ceiling above. Lara knelt beside it, dipping her hand into the water. The glow around her brightened, and she let out a soft sigh. "What is this place?" John asked, his voice hushed. "A sanctuary," Lara said. "For now." John sat beside her, his eyes fixed on the glowing pool. For the first time since this nightmare began, he felt a small flicker of calm. But it didn't last. In the distance, he could hear the hunters' guttural voices growing louder. "They're coming," he said, his voice tinged with dread. Lara nodded, her expression grim. "Then we'll make our stand here, together." For the first time, John didn't feel entirely helpless. He didn't fully trust Lara, and he certainly didn't understand the bond. But he knew one thing. If they were going to survive, they would have to face whatever came next as a team. Betrayal. The glowing pool cast soft, flickering light across the cavern as John and Lara sat in uneasy silence. The sound of dripping water echoed faintly, interrupted only by the distant rumble of approaching footsteps. The hunters were closing in. Yet John's mind wasn't on their immediate danger. It was on the alien girl sitting beside him, the one who had thrown his life into chaos. "You're not telling me everything," John said finally, breaking the silence. Lara didn't respond at first. Her gaze was fixed on the glowing pool, her reflection shifting in its rippling surface. "I've told you what you need to know," she said, her voice quiet. "That's not good enough," John snapped, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "I've been dragged across God knows how many light years, hunted by alien death squads, and bonded to you without my consent. I deserve the whole truth." Lara's tendrils flickered faintly, a sign of her agitation. "The truth is dangerous. So is ignorance," John shot back. "If I'm going to stay alive, if we're both going to stay alive, I need to know what I'm dealing with. What aren't you telling me?" Lara finally turned to face him, her luminous eyes filled with a mix of guilt and determination. "The hunters aren't just after you because you're human," she admitted. "It's the bond. It didn't just save your life. It changed you." "Changed me how?" John asked, his voice lowering. "The bond unlocked something within you," Lara said. "A potential that was dormant before. My people call it the Ankari effect. When a human bonds with one of us, it creates a feedback loop of energy, a kind of evolutionary acceleration. You're stronger now, faster, more adaptable. And your mind." "My mind?" John asked warily. Lara hesitated, her gaze shifting away. "It's different. You can sense things most beings can't. Patterns, intentions, even emotions. It's why the hunters are so desperate to capture you. They believe you're the key to unlocking this ability for themselves." John stared at her, his mind racing. "So, what? I'm some kind of lab experiment to them." "To them, you're a weapon," Lara said softly. "But to me," she paused, her voice faltering. "To me, you're something much more important." Before John could press her further, the ground beneath them shuddered. A low, guttural growl echoed through the cavern, sending ripples across the glowing pool. Lara shot to her feet, her body tense. "They're here," she whispered. John followed her gaze to the cavern entrance, where shadows began to shift. The hunters had arrived, their sleek, armored forms illuminated by the faint light of the pool. Their weapons hummed with energy, and their movements were deliberate, predatory. "We can't fight them here," Lara said, grabbing John's arm. "We need to." "No," John interrupted, pulling his arm free. "I'm done running. If they're here because of me, then I need to face them." "You don't understand," Lara said, her voice trembling. "If they capture you, then tell me why," John shouted, his voice echoing off the cavern walls. "Tell me the real reason they want me, or I'm not going anywhere." Lara's tendrils dimmed, and for a moment she looked almost fragile. "Because they want to break the bond," she said finally. "They believe they can replicate it if they dissect you. But breaking it, it'll kill us both." John's chest tightened. "Then why didn't you tell me that from the start?" "Because I didn't think you'd trust me," Lara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "And because I didn't want you to hate me." John opened his mouth to respond, but the hunters chose that moment to strike. One of them raised its weapon and fired, a bolt of energy streaking through the air. Lara threw up a glowing barrier just in time, the blast ricocheting off and slamming into the cavern wall. "Move," she shouted, shoving John toward the back of the cavern. He stumbled, but quickly regained his footing. The hunters advanced, their movements unnervingly precise. Lara fought to hold them back, her glowing hands weaving intricate patterns in the air as she deflected their attacks. John ducked behind a jagged rock, his heart pounding. He felt a strange sensation building in his chest, a pressure, like something trying to break free. He clenched his fists, trying to focus. Then it happened. A burst of energy erupted from his body, invisible but powerful. The nearest hunter staggered, its weapon falling from its grasp. The others hesitated, their movements suddenly sluggish. What was that?" John asked, staring at his hands. Lara glanced back at him, her eyes wide. "The bond," she said. "It's awakening." John didn't have time to process her words. The hunters regrouped, their weapons charging with renewed energy. Lara stepped in front of him, her glowing aura flaring brightly. "I can't hold them off much longer," she said, her voice strained. "You have to decide, John. Fight or run." John looked at her, then at the advancing hunters. His mind raced. He didn't fully understand what was happening to him, but one thing was clear. He couldn't keep relying on Lara to protect him. He had to take control of his fate. "Then let's fight," he said, his voice steady. Lara nodded, a small determined smile crossing her face. "Together." As the hunters closed in, John felt the pressure in his chest building again. This time, he didn't resist it. He let it flow through him, channeling the energy into his movements. For the first time, he wasn't just running for his life. He was fighting for it. And he wasn't alone. The final stand. The cavern was alive with chaos. Blinding flashes of light and deafening roars reverberated through the air as Lara and John faced the relentless onslaught of the hunters. Their sleek, armored forms moved with terrifying precision, their weapons humming with lethal energy. Yet, something had changed. John wasn't just running anymore. He was fighting. "Stay close to me," Lara shouted, her voice barely audible over the din. Her glowing hands carved arcs of light in the air, creating barriers that deflected the hunters' energy blasts. John didn't answer. His focus was locked on the nearest hunter, his body surging with unfamiliar energy. He dodged a swipe from its blade-like weapon and countered with an instinctive burst of force. The hunter staggered, its armor cracking under the invisible blow. "Nice shot," Lara called out, a flicker of approval in her voice. "Don't get used to it," John muttered, ducking as another energy bolt seared past his head. The hunters regrouped, forming a tight circle around their prey. Their leader, a towering figure with intricate markings on its armor, stepped forward, its weapon glowing with a menacing red light. It barked something in its guttural language, and the others spread out, tightening the noose. "They're coordinating," Lara said, her tone grim. "They want to cut off our escape." John clenched his fists, the energy within him pulsing in response to his rising anger. "Then we don't give them the chance." Before Lara could respond, he charged forward, the force building in his chest like a tidal wave. He thrust his hands out, and a shockwave erupted from his body, sending 2 hunters flying into the cavern walls. The leader turned to him, its glowing eyes narrowing. "John, wait," Lara cried, but it was too late. The leader raised its weapon and fired. The bolt of red energy streaked toward John, too fast to dodge. At the last second, Lara leaped in front of him, her glowing barrier absorbing the impact. The force knocked her to the ground, her glow flickering dangerously. "Lara!" John shouted, dropping to her side. She pushed herself up, wincing. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice was weak. "But you can't keep fighting them like this. The bond is still new. You're not ready." "I don't have a choice," John said, his voice firm. "If we don't stop them now, we'll never get another chance." Lara hesitated, then nodded. "If we're doing this, we do it together. Follow my lead." The two of them stood, their backs to the glowing pool as the hunters advanced. Lara's aura flared brighter than before, her movements swift and fluid as she wove patterns of light. John mirrored her, focusing the energy within him into controlled bursts. It felt natural, like a muscle he hadn't known he possessed. The cavern became a battlefield, each movement a dance of survival. Lara's barriers deflected incoming blasts while John's shockwaves kept the hunters at bay. Despite their efforts, the enemy pressed forward, their coordination flawless. "We can't keep this up," Lara said, her breathing labored. "There are too many." "Then we end it," John said, his voice steady despite the chaos. Lara glanced at him, her eyes widening as she realized his intent. "John, no. If you push the bond too far, it could kill you. It could kill us." "Better than letting them win," John said. He turned to her, his expression resolute. "You've been protecting me this whole time. Let me protect you for once." Before Lara could argue, John stepped forward, his hands glowing with an intense, crackling light. The hunters paused, their weapons raised but their movements uncertain. Even their leader seemed momentarily taken aback. "Come on," John shouted, his voice echoing through the cavern. "You want me? Here I am." The hunters surged forward as one, their weapons blazing. John unleashed the energy within him, a massive shockwave that rippled through the air like a storm. The ground shook, the cavern walls cracking under the force. The glowing pool erupted in a cascade of light, its energy joining John's in a brilliant explosion. The hunters were thrown back, their armor shattering under the impact. One by one, they fell, their movements faltering until they lay motionless. The leader staggered to its feet, its armor scorched and cracked. It glared at John, raising its weapon for one final attack. Before it could fire, Lara stepped forward, her hands glowing with a blinding intensity. She thrust her palms out, and a beam of light shot toward the leader, piercing its chest. The hunter let out a guttural roar before collapsing, its weapon clattering to the ground. Silence fell over the cavern, broken only by the faint hum of the glowing pool. John dropped to his knees, the energy within him dissipating. He felt drained, every muscle in his body trembling. Lara knelt beside him, her glow dim but steady. "You did it," she said softly. "We did it," John corrected, managing a faint smile. She returned the smile, though it was tinged with sadness. "But it's not over. The bond, it's changing you faster than I expected. If we don't find a way to stabilize it, this won't be the last time we're hunted." John nodded, too exhausted to argue. For now, they had survived. But deep down, He knew Lyra was right. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a much larger fight. The truth and the choice. The cavern was eerily silent now, the remnants of the battle scattered around John and Lyra. The glowing pool had dimmed, its light flickering weakly as though it, too, had been drained by the fight. The bodies of the hunters lay motionless, their once intimidating forms now reduced to broken remnants. John sat on the ground, leaning against a jagged rock, every breath labored. Across from him, Lyra knelt, her glowing markings faint and her tendrils limp. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air felt heavy, not just with exhaustion, but with the weight of everything left unsaid. Finally, John broke the silence. What happens now? Lyra didn't answer immediately. She traced her fingers across the ground, drawing absent patterns in the dirt. When she finally looked up, her expression was unreadable. Now do you decide? John frowned. Decide what? Lyra hesitated, her luminous eyes locking onto his. Whether to keep the bond, or break it. Her words hit him like a punch to the chest. Break it? I thought you said that wasn't possible. It isn't supposed to be, Lyra admitted. But there's a way. A dangerous, ancient method. It would sever our connection, free us from each other. But there's a cost. John narrowed his eyes. What kind of cost? If the bond is broken improperly, it could destroy both of us, Lyra said. And even if it works, you'll lose everything the bond has given you. Your strength, your abilities, everything. You'll be ordinary again. John leaned his head back against the rock, staring at the cavern's jagged ceiling. And what about you? What happens to you if we break it? Lyra looked away. I don't know. The bond is as much a part of me as it is of you. Without it, she trailed off, her voice trembling. John closed his eyes, letting her words sink in. He had spent the last few days resenting the bond, hating what it had done to his life. But now, faced with the possibility of losing it, and the connection he had with Lyra, he wasn't so sure. What if we don't break it? He asked quietly. Lyra's gaze snapped back to him. Then you'll keep changing, she said. The bond will keep evolving, pushing your body and mind further. You'll become stronger, faster, but less human. The hunters, or others like them, will never stop coming for you. You'll never have peace. Great options, John muttered. Either I risk dying or spend the rest of my life as a target. It's not just about you, John, Lyra said, her voice rising slightly. The bond ties us both. If you choose to keep it, my fate is bound to yours. Every risk you take, every choice you make, it affects me too. John looked at her, really looked at her. For all her strength and otherworldly beauty, there was a vulnerability in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. She had been protecting him, guiding him, even when it cost her. And now she was giving him the choice to decide their fate. Why are you telling me this now? He asked. You could have kept this from me, made the decision yourself. Because it's your life, Lyra said simply. I made the choice to bond with you, but I won't force you to live with it. You deserve to choose your own path. John let out a bitter laugh. And if I choose wrong? There is no wrong choice, Lyra said, her voice soft but firm. There's only what you're willing to live with. John closed his eyes again, his mind spinning. He thought of everything he had been through since the crash. The fear, the confusion, the pain. But he also thought of the moments of triumph, the strength he had found within himself, and the strange but undeniable connection he shared with Lyra. I don't know if I can go back to being ordinary, he admitted. Not after everything. You don't have to, Lyra said. But if you choose to keep the bond, you have to understand what it means. There's no going back after this. John opened his eyes, meeting her gaze. And what about you? What do you want? Lyra hesitated, her expression unreadable. What I want doesn't matter. This is your decision. That's not good enough, John said, his voice firm. I'm not the only one living with this. Tell me the truth, Lyra. What do you want? For a moment, she looked like she might argue. But then she sighed, her shoulders slumping. I don't want to lose you, she said quietly. I don't want to lose this. John felt a lump rise in his throat. He nodded slowly, his decision crystallizing in his mind. Then we don't break it, he said. We figure out how to live with it, together. Lyra's eyes widened, her tendrils flickering faintly. You're sure? No, John admitted with a small smile. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that I'm not doing this alone. A faint smile crossed Lyra's lips, though her eyes glistened with unused tears. Then we move forward, she said, together. The sound of distant footsteps broke the moment, reminding them of the dangers still lingering outside the cavern. John stood, offering a hand to Lyra. She took it, and for the first time, he felt a sense of balance between them, not protector and protected, but equals. As they stepped out of the cavern, the alien sky stretched before them, vast and unending. The hunters might come again. More dangers might lie ahead. But for now, John and Lyra had made their choice. Whatever the future held, they would face it as one.